Hello, welcome to the second edition of the Revive and Thrive podcast, Actionable Steps for Physician Dads to Combat Burnout. I'm your host, Joshua Blum. I'm a psychiatrist. I work primarily with children and young adults in college settings, but this is not a podcast about me. I just say that as a way of introduction so you know who's talking to you. If you haven't checked out the first episode, go ahead and do so if you have the chance. The point of this show is really to talk about actionable steps to work on physician burnout, specifically for physician fathers. Our situation is a little bit different than sort of a generalist burnout approach. And the focus is on little actionable steps that you can start to do in your day-to-day life. We're going through the alphabet A to Z, and A, we talked about, is your aim. Really, it's talking about goals. Your goals will often change depending on your phase of life, but knowing where you want to end up is really important. Where we started, when we started, thinking about medicine as a career, maybe it was in undergrad, maybe it was even before that. For me, I was kind of late to this game, so it started sort of after college, and then of course will change once you have finished medical school and you're thinking about residency and what you want to do. And so it's going to be different in each of those steps, but if it does not anymore, if it no longer aligns with what you thought was going to be true and what you actually know is true now in your life, then that's an important area of conflict in your head that is important to at least recognize. You may not necessarily be able to do anything about it, but it's important to at least recognize that it is a thing because it can be the source of a lot of distress. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be going through the alphabet, and right after A, for all you linguists, is B, at least in the English alphabet. So B is for boundary. And what we're going to be talking about is a boundary is almost like a wall. But it's where can we find protected pockets of time in our lives where we can kind of you can sort of just do your own thing. You can learn, you can do whatever you want, you can just be yourself. Two areas, I'm just going to focus on two because everybody's situation is different there. But for all of us, we're all physicians. And whether you're practicing or you're retired or you're in some combination of both, being a physician is a demanding job. And there are a lot of things pulling at your time. It's often very difficult to explain to other people who are not in the same career path. Where I work in a college setting and often work with a number of psychologists. They have quite a different training. It can be fairly long as well, but it's much different. And I think they take a more intentional kind of approach to their time. There's a lot that you can learn from that sort of approach. But I will say, and we'll touch upon some of that, but I will say that it often makes it quite difficult for them to kind of understand why we often get pulled in so many different directions and why there's so many different distractions, for lack of a better term. Now, being a parent often comes with a number of distractions. In the background, you may be able to hear some noises. I'm doing this as I'm with my kids. And as I mentioned in the first episode, if we waited for the exact right moment to be able to do something, we often won't necessarily get it done. It's just too many other things. So there may be certain things that we can do that we can do two things at once. I'm not always saying that's a great idea. There may be also other ways of maximizing the time you have when you are actually working. So one of the things that comes up a lot, this idea of multitasking. Multitasking can sometimes be a good thing. It sometimes can be a not great thing. For some people, they need to do several things at the same time. For other people, they find it incredibly distracting. But one thing is for sure, for certain tasks that require you to really be on, it's really going to be very hard for your brain to have the bandwidth to do other things. On the other hand, there may be certain things that you can do and may even benefit from certain background things happening. For example, if you remember back to undergrad, doing your homework and having, the radio playing in the background. You may have found that you could actually stay on task and focus for certain kinds of music, but not others. And so it's going to vary incredibly depending on the person. But part of us understanding how to protect certain parts of our time is trying to figure out how can we be efficient in doing what we have to do when we're actually doing it. So we're not trying to do multiple things at the same time. Because if there's a way to certainly amplify that feeling of being scattered and pulled in multiple different directions, it is trying to do multiple things at the same time and accomplishing nothing. Unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of people in the physician realm. You're trying to do something and you're getting paged, or you're having people saying, I need to do this. If you work in front of a computer, you may have notifications, with your email or whatever. Say, I need this and I need that, or different tasks that you have to do on the list that comes up. And the natural tendency may be, I got to go check that. So the first thing I will say is that if you're doing things that require you to stay on task, to think about, okay, what's the cost for me to get distracted from it? Am I the sort of person where when I get distracted, it's going to take me a pretty long time for me to get back into it? Or is it the sort of work where that same thing is going to be true? Certain kinds of work may be just easier to get into, but others, it may take a little bit of a mental shift or quite a bit of a mental shift to actually get back to what you're doing. I spent a lot of time working with folks who have ADHD. One of the things that folks who have ADHD or any other kind of attention difficulty struggles with is this very thing. In fact, that's probably the biggest thing that I would say tends to be a unifying thing about any kind of attention issue, is that once you get distracted from whatever you're doing, can you get back to what you're doing? Can your brain shift to a new task? There's a cost to that every single time that happens. Now, just in the course of recording this, just a few minutes, I was interrupted at least 3 or 4 times. So for some people, that would be a no-go. For me, I've been doing podcasts and I've been talking about the subject long enough that that's not really a big deal. It's very easy for me to get right back into it. But for certain other things, I know that's not really going to be the case. Writing certain notes or something like that, doing something that requires you to really focus and zone in, I know it's going to be hard if I get interrupted. So I'm probably not going to even attempt to do that at a time when I know I'm going to be interrupted. One of the things that can be really helpful in this way is to think about before you actually decide to do something, do you actually have the time allotted right now to attend to it if it takes longer than expected? So a good example of this would be email. Email is a huge time suck, or you can insert any other thing like that. I don't know how many email addresses I have for work. I have at least 3, and then there's all the electronic, patient portal kind of things. And then there's some that just come from like the front desk, which are totally not helpful at all, but you kind of have to do them. So I don't know, there's like 5, 6 of those things. I mean, many of you probably have the same kind of thing. Each of those will, even if it's just a little message, may actually take a lot longer. Front desk says like, this person is calling for an appointment. They can't get in. Can you squeeze them in here? It's going to take me 5, 10, 15 minutes to figure that out in some cases, get back to the patient, all this kind of stuff like that. I may not have that time. For those things, I know for me, and this may be different for you, but for me, I find that I have to do that at a time when I'm not going to be interrupted. I can't just sort of squeeze that in. Many of us can check email or some of these other messages. Like, for example, we use Epic. And so you can actually check those messages sometimes on your phone. But do you really want to? Is it now the best time to do that when you're, say, with somebody else? You're at dinner, or you're trying to do that on a family, you're a passenger in a car on a family vacation, or it's on a weekend or some other time when you're not working. You're not on call. Do you really want to be doing it then? Can it wait? So the biggest thing I think when it comes to putting boundaries on our time is just to recognize that we are the gatekeepers of that. Other people will try to invade it constantly. That's why it's a wall, right? It has to be permeable to some degree because there has to be some things that can't necessarily be so, they have to be able to break through that. There's emergencies that happen, but we have to be able to say that our lack of control over our schedule is a huge part of what often contributes to burnout. When you're constantly pulled in multiple different directions, it can be very, very frustrating. You don't really feel like you're getting anywhere. You feel like you're running on a treadmill, but you have nothing to show for it. As an aside, I often encourage people to look for things that they can do in their life that look a little bit different before versus after. So after the task is done, you have the sense of completion that you may not necessarily get from your day-to-day work. As physicians, we do see that, but it may take a long time, months, years sometimes, and it can often be very difficult to see those incremental changes that may actually be happening, but either we're too close to it or it's just happening too slowly for us to see. So it's just sort of a side thing. We'll talk more about that sort of stuff later. But the other thing I would say that can be really helpful to think about, if you look at your schedule, and if you don't have a way of planning out your schedule, some people sort of keep it all in their head. They kind of just do it that way. If you don't have some way to do it, especially if you are a visual person, I'd really encourage you to think about putting it somewhere, a whiteboard, if it's in your phone, a paper calendar, whatever. I know that may seem obvious to some folks, but there are plenty of people I know who just sort of keep it all mentally, and I don't know how they do it. But I think one of the things is that may come with a cost. They're sort of like occupying some system resources to keep that mental calendar going. And so you want to offload that to somewhere else. It's like, what's that movie? It's a 30 Indiana Jones movie, where he's, The Last Crusade, where he's talking about to his father. Harrison Ford is talking to the Sean Connery character. He's like, about the Grail diary. He's like, well, don't you remember? And his father says, no, I wrote it down so I don't have to remember. And it's exactly that. We want to offload some of these things to sort of para-brain kinds of things to be able to free up some resources. And one of the things that you may actually want to do when you're thinking about creating your schedule is to actually create some protected pockets of time and actually schedule them in. Now, this could be things that you would think, well, it'd be silly to put that in a schedule. But on the other hand, if you schedule it, it may in fact get done, especially if you tend to refer to your schedule a lot. That may include things that you may not necessarily think to schedule. You may not necessarily put exercise or time with your family or husband and wife time, those kind of things like that in your schedule. But on the other hand, if you can be intentional about it, this is where I learned something from some of the folks I work with who, when, as physicians, we often say yes to a lot of things. We often feel like we can't say no. And that's a whole nother topic. But they'll be like, no, I can't do that. I'm leaving now. It's 4:00. And you're like, God damn it. So we can learn from that too. Now, we may not have as much freedom and flexibility to do that. But on the other hand, there is something that you can take from that kind of approach of putting up some walls around your time and saying there's a time for one thing and it's not time for something else. One of the things I sometimes you may have some certain rules, for example, in your household about this, that at dinner time, for example, you don't watch TV or you don't answer the phone or whatever, things like that. And it's helpful to be able to model that in multiple different facets of life. So if necessary, communicate some of those things to other people. But the other thing, when you have your protected time, this is what I would say, is you don't actually have to tell people what you're doing. It's just your protected time. It's time for you to do whatever you think is right. Now, some of that may mean that you may have to go to bed a little bit earlier, get up a little bit earlier, stay up a little bit later, those kind of things like that, to find that protected time. Or there may be things that you are not able to do because of that. However, what I would say is for the very first step, we'll talk about that sort of negotiation process in a future episode, but for the first step, I would say start looking for it, because my guess is that those pockets of time exist, even if it's just for a couple of minutes. And as we talked about before, if we start small, if we start now, if we start in a way that's sustainable long term, it will be something that you'll be able to do today. And then it'll be something that you'll be able to do tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. And it will get easier and better as you go along. But because you started small, it'll be possible for you to do long term. So thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.